going through 75. So that was...
You're at lunch.
I was at lunch.
But that's 75, but you stayed till 85, and in that time one would have thought there was some changes in technology and computing that might have fed into the research, or changes in research design, changes in things you were doing. Were there any developments beyond the psychographics come reasonably early in your period?
Well, with the technology, I remember we had the first desktop computer in News Limited, the research department, or the marketing service department, as it was called, and that was mainly for the scheduling, to run the schedules. Because then, when you had a desktop, you weren't paying by the hour, so you could run as many as you liked and it didn't cost you any more. The other thing that Chris alluded to that the research department did provide was the market share reports of advertising. By lunchtime, management and all the salespeople knew exactly what proportion of the advertising dollars, or advertising centimetres in those days, had gone to each paper, and that's what the ad managers and ad directors were judged on. So that was a big part, and getting the desktop computer made that a lot easier as well, instead of doing it on time sharing. So that was a big part of the job there. And with the syndicated, the Morgan survey, as well as mainly being used for advertising, that was then also used to feed in, as Chris said, to management in terms of trends in readership, in terms of demographics going up and down, and all that kind of thing. It was a constant battle with Morgan that I remember, Mark, we never really liked the numbers that we got from... No, they never made any sense. And every time, he'd come out every 6 months, and the general manager then was Jim McPherson, and you'd get the numbers and he'd say, you better go down and see Gary. So every 6 months I'd fly down, sit on the plane and say, I don't know what I'm going to say to him this time. And, so it was a constant battle, because they were, and it was more the Mirror was disadvantaged, because the sampling wasn't that good. As Chris said, the readership and Terry of the Mirror was in the West, and Morgan's sampling wasn't that good. It was geared to measuring politics, opinion polls, and if it worked in the political sense, it didn't mean it was going to work in a readership sense. So there was a lot of controversy about that kind of thing. During those periods when I took over from Chris, one of the things I was interested in was doing more editorial research and that kind of thing. And we started doing that more on the tabloids. And I can remember, Mark, you were there one day. It was the only time I ever thought anyone was going to kick down the two-way mirror. A respondent, I don't know whether you remember this day, you'd spent a fortune buying a book, and she waffled on how terrific the book was that she read in the Sun, and Mark was on the Mirror, and there was all his money, and this respondent saying how wonderful it was, and she's going to buy the Sun for the rest of her life. I don't remember doing a lot of that kind of research on the Australian. It was more on the tabloids, and in that sense it wasn't used by the editorial side as much as for marketing the papers themselves and the advertising of the papers. And I got involved into, and to my knowledge it hadn't been done prior to that, but we started writing advertising briefs to give to the agency for the paper to say how to market that and have a position to say how are we going to promote that paper, and to try to generate circulation. So when we actually did start to do reader surveys outside the syndicated surveys, they were tended to be used more for marketing and positioning the paper rather than for editorial. Because I can remember being at a meeting with Rupert, and it was one of the first meetings I went that I was at with Rupert, and an editor was under the pump, as sometimes they got in those management meetings, and the first thing that came in, he said, oh, we should do some research and find out what the readers want. And Rupert said, with all respect to Sol, we don't need that. And I was always sorry after that day. The fact that he even knew my name, I was so flattered. I didn't challenge him or question it. I just let it go to the keeper. But and his view then, and he said, you know, a good editor will know what the readers want. And you know, the editors knew, like they put front page out every day, they get a circulation the next day, they know what's selling and all that kind of thing. So that would tended to be his view. So I didn't get very far with doing research for editorial purposes, and that tended to be the...
You couldn't stand up to Rupert, but you could stand up to Gary, Morgan, But you couldn't threaten to withdraw News Limited subscription to the syndicated surveys? Wouldn't make any sense. You did?
I did, yeah. Okay. And Roy took me out to lunch with Gary.
Yep.
And told me how he brought up Gary exactly the way he wanted to be. Don't depend on any... I can remember, it was just awful. You don't have to be nice to people and all that. I thought you've been 100% successful. Roy said that. And we did threaten to withdraw. And management then got cold feet. And I think the belief was... Management were unhappy with the syndicated survey, but no one knew if you did an alternative whether it was going to be better or not. Yeah. And to spend all the money. And we now have Emma. You know, it's taken all these years, and credit to Heather for getting it off the ground. But it was the early 80s, and we got sort of part of the way of doing it, but then it fell apart, and it was sort of better the devil you know than we don't know what we're going to get kind of thing. So that was
all right.
A constant battle.
Thanks, Sol. Now Matt comes in not after you, but after John Davis, who's not with us. And John Davis was the group manager for marketing services from 85 to 89 when Matt enters. And Matt oversees introduction of colour and networking of News Limited papers.
From a research point of view.
From research point of view. So tell us about this from research point of view.
Was a time for the media and for news of huge change, as many people here will remember. Because when I came, you were talking about the Daily Mirror and the Daily Telegraph. Well, the research department had been separated off to give the sales reps the opportunity to speak to researchers in private, because their number one competitor, if they worked for the Daily Telegraph, was the Daily Mirror. Number one competitor for the Mirror was the Daily Telegraph. So it was a very... Newspapers were competing entirely with themselves. The organisation was growing globally enormously, so I think I came probably just after Australia was kind of stopping being the centre of the universe for it. The Times had been acquired, and I think the Times group were pretty much a model of where much of what was going to happen with newspapers in Australia was going to be, and particularly the Times themselves and the Sunday Times were the model for the Australian in many ways. And the British market was enormously different because there was a huge amount of national advertising money in newspapers, vastly more newspapers, much bigger market, and that money wasn't around in Australia if you competed for the newspaper advertising dollar. So I think the main thing that happened during my 8 or so years was a shift in attention for where money would come from being from other newspapers, which by and large we owned anyway, to other media. So Sol talked about the reach and frequency schedule thing, and when I walked in there was these couple of things. I'm not sure, I think it would be kind of a compliment to call them desktop computers, but they did something a bit like a computer to this competing for advertising enormously with reach and frequency schedules, which basically plan media in a comparable way to what TV did and radio. So during the period, the focus of the sales teams that had all changed enormously was fortunately, very wisely, from other newspapers to other media. Apart from anything, of course, the number of newspapers shrank quite significantly because we had the mergers of quite a lot of the tabloids. The news in Adelaide closed, so the Adelaide Advertiser couldn't just compete for the news. The Australian had, if you looked at it that way, the Fin Review and Sydney Morning Herald and the Age as its competitors, but the papers in terms of their revenue structures were radically different because Fairfax papers had what was then print classifieds and so on. So you had to compete in using national technology against national media, and so that changed dramatically. And in my later years, Jerry Harris was the advertising director, and he was brilliant at that. So the department changed enormously, the market changed enormously, and the whole culture and view of the organisation changed because by the time I was leaving, Foxtel was being born. Pay TV was seen as the great new media of the time, and while it was a great new media of the time, another media was also being born at the same time, which at that time we completely ignored, everyone laughed at, and it was called the internet. And nobody expected that to be significant. If we get a chance, there's a little video, but the vision of what electronic media and advertising would do to newspapers was similar to what's actually has come about today, tablets and things, but it had nothing to do with the internet. So it was all about the changing revenues, and it was all happening so fast that, you know, I'm sure the advertising sales managers were in a spin. The other thing that happened was for want of a better word, the nationalisation of advertising sales, which, looking back on it 20 years later, is no-brainer. But at the time it sent people reeling in shock, which was that you had advertising sales teams for each publication who never ever spoke to the other advertising sales teams. They were usually their number one competitor before any other. And that all merged into Newsnet, and the Australian was part of that. So apart from local sales, you wound up with these advertising sales people who in those days, well, for some years were in North Sydney, probably into your era briefly, and they were going out and representing the whole set of newspapers. So how they did that was obviously very different, in the reach and frequency schedules from having just the Australian and the Fin Review. For the Australian now had 20 publications in them. So there was a lot of change.
And in that period, are there changes in the technology that impact on the sort of research capacity or research methods?
Yes, there was enormous change in technology for newspapers, because we went to colour, we moved to Chalora. That was tied in, obviously, to the move to competing for national advertising and advertising from revenue from other media, because one of the big stories of colour was that you can do glitzy national brand creative advertising, like examples from the UK and the Times, and not have to compete with newspapers in black and white so much. So all of those things tied in. In those days, this possibly may be still the same language, but the Australian, or all the newspapers went to Chalora we called it by fax, and it was a form of fax. I don't know if they still use that word, but and the department went from having these two boxes to highly computerised, and changing from a world where there was occasionally terminals to people sat at keyboards, and that's how you did.
But the sorts of things that you were doing in a research department, the concepts you were using, the measures you were using, was there any relationship between the technological change and any of these? Did those things change at all? The concepts, the notions of audience, anything at all like that change?
The biggest thing was trying to look at other media and compete for a share of people's, to show that newspapers were a share of people's attention and time and credibility in general. And the Australian obviously was a very important slice of that, because it had a very defined part of the market, whereas if you looked at, say, the Telly and the Herald Sun, etc., very similar profiles to you. So Australian had a unique place in that combination. And taking that to agencies and trying to show the outcome of that audience in the same language and style, reach and frequency schedules, that TV and radio did. Very much so.
Okay. Good, thanks. And Heather, sorry it's taken so long. You succeed Leanne Smith as the Marketing Services Manager in 1998. She's there from 1996 to 1998. But the position you filled was that of Strategy Planning Manager at News Limited, not Marketing Services Manager. And from 2005 you become the Director of the News Intelligence Group. How does your remit as the Director of the News Intelligence Group differ from your original remit as the Strategy Planning Manager?
Okay, well, to start off with, I actually came in the Strategy Planning Manager role was really about, there had been, as everyone along here has actually mentioned, a lot of focus on research being about selling advertising, quite frankly, and there was a demand to actually understand readers more and our audiences more from the perspective of what that meant from an editorial and marketing point of view. But in the day-to-day of the marketing services teams around the country, and they still existed when I started as well, by the way, but around the country, and they were just, bang, 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 helping get proposals out to clients, going and visiting clients with sales reps, and keeping the money coming in the door. Because quite frankly, you need the money coming in the door, or there's no paper, there's no editorial, there's no anything. But our editors and our marketers were saying that nobody has enough time for us. We don't have enough time to explore things, to understand things, or any of those things. So there was a real change because media was changing, our competitors were changing, who were fighting much more for time and audience as newspapers. There's a demand to actually understand those readers better and engage with them better and to know them better, and that's where research was falling in. So some of the things so that was really why I came into the role, was because I actually came from a consumer research background, understanding consumers being my primary thing.
At Morgan Research, you were at Morgan Research?
So I'd been at Morgan's, I'd been at Millward Brown,
right.
So it had been consumer-based research, and it had been about brand, it had been about, so with Morgan's it had been about audience and various other things, and in fact News Limited was one of my clients, and I actually worked on the Australian as one of, so I worked on a project on the Australian when we're talking about demographics and things like that. I was, when I went to Morgan's, I was actually worked on value segments, yes. And so I worked on a project specifically for the Australian.
You better say what value segments are.
Yeah, so value segments is a psychographic segmentation tool that Morgan's developed with Colin Benjamin, and that had 10 different segments, and the main segment for the Australian was actually a group called Socially Aware. And so, and as that name suggests, the people who were, and all of these guys have done the same research that says the same things about the Australian audience, that they think, that they care about things, that they want to know more, and that's what Socially Aware is about, and also that they like to spend money, and it's not all about being green or any of those things. They're intellectually interested but still like to have the Armani suit as it was back in the 90s. That's a while ago now, but that concept, and so I was doing research on that for the Australian. So my actual experience with the Australian actually goes back to before I started.
But you have a much more positive view about Morgan's research than, say, Sol seemed to have.
Used to pay a wage, well, wouldn't you?
Really, I spent 10 years of every day pretty much every day having every quarter, because you were lucky, Sol, it was only every 6 months. It was every quarter for me that the audience figures would come in, or the readership figures actually, because they weren't audience figures, because they didn't necessarily go across all platforms as they do now with the new Emma software. And we didn't necessarily back then have we didn't have all the platforms either. When I first started, the internet was still nascent, and while the Australian might have had one of the first news websites out there, it didn't have the kind of reach of audience that it has now. So I used to continually have fights with Roy Morgan. I would have many fights not with Roy himself, but with Gary Morgan. I used to have flights down to Melbourne myself to go and have a discussion about why can't we seem to capture the Australian audience? Why does the audience for the Australian and the AFR, these two titles, why do they jump up and down so much? Because they used to swing wildly from period to period. Why can't you measure the Weekend Australian magazine? Why can't you actually get a number for this? Why is it so low when we know that we're circulating this much and the audience is like this, and when we do our own research we know people are reading it? Why can't you get these things right? So we're continually having those discussions, and eventually as an industry came together and
That's much more recent, that's right.
And came together and went, this isn't actually working for us anymore. This methodology, this way of doing things isn't working for the industry anymore. With audience, there's technology out there that can be used and harnessed better to measure our audiences. How do we use that? And how do we work with the people like the Nielsen online ratings? Because guess what? Digital's really important. It's a lot of our audience. It wasn't being measured properly, and we couldn't combine it together with the print audience, which still is a very big and important audience for us.
Before we get say something more about that, you're associated with a number of pretty significant firsts at News Limited. One is the brand tracking program. Can you tell us about the brand tracking program?
Well, for a very long time, and we still struggle with the concept, but newspapers aren't just a piece of thing that sits on the paper. They're actually a brand. And our editors and our marketers understood that they were a brand, but our editors struggled for a very long time to conceptualise the idea and the concept that they were a brand, and that they actually have brand values and that they stand for. They knew that they stood for something, but they didn't understand that it actually stands for something that sits beyond the paper itself. And multi-platform has actually helped that process, I think, understanding that this brand lives on in people's minds above and beyond what happens on the printed page. So the Brand Health Monitor was actually one of those things, and I actually worked with Matt Belloc, because he was my researcher. Small world, very small world. And we built this a brand tracking study. Leanne Smith was actually involved in it, and then it started, and then I took it over from her.
What does a brand tracking study do?
And the brand tracking study was to look at the perceptions of the brand. It ran every day of the year, or 48 weeks of the year, interviewing people, asking them their opinions on various attributes. So, for example, one of them was about sensationalism, which was kind of quite important to the tabloids. Understanding when they'd gone too far, perhaps, with a story. You could actually see it spike up if for one of the brands around the country, if they probably stepped over the mark as far as their readers were concerned, and their non-readers. So that we were measuring.
You've got some secrets about the Australian you can share with us? As Philip Adams would say, it's only you and me.
Well, the Australian, not surprisingly, was a pretty steady brand. But one of the things is it's a very well-established and well-known brand, as in that it exists out there, but it's still, relatively speaking, despite its big influence, and these guys have talked about it as well, is that it actually doesn't have the largest audience in the world, but that audience is very influential. But everyone pretty much knows what it stood for, and that it stood for national and important things, and about being informative and those sort of things, more so than other papers.
When you say influential, who did the audience influence?
The audience influence. The audience would influence other people that they talk to. So they would see it as, because they like to talk. When you get, if you ever get Australian readers into a focus group, you cannot keep them quiet. Seriously, and they're very opinionated, and they're great. They're fantastic. Actually getting them to the focus group, on the other hand, is the really hard thing, and you really have to partner really hard with your research company to actually get them, because they're busy. They're out influencing people. They're not wanting to sit in a room and talk. Once you get them in the room, they will talk away.
All right, another one, the interactive readers panel.
Okay, so
when's that established, and what is it?
That was established in about 2006. And so basically we actually recruited people from ads in our papers across the whole country, because by this time my role had actually moved to completely national in terms of consumer. So I had just been looking after the Australian and the Telegraphs, or what was the Telegraph Mirror when I started, from a consumer point of view, and looking after the brand tracking with the move to a reader panel. So the one thing that didn't work so well with editorial, with the reader panel, is we used to have lots with the brand health tracking. It was great for marketing people, but it wasn't quite as good for editorial as we might have hoped, because it would always come up with why is that? Why has my score on something gone up? And it didn't have so much of the why. It was the tracking. It told you tracking, it didn't tell you why. And any editor worth their salt wants to know why. Because how can you change things if you don't know why? Or how can you keep doing the right thing if you don't know why? So we recruited these people to go on an online panel. We had very, very generous incentives, I might add, to get these people to join and participate. And we would survey. We had a survey company running it for us, and we would we'd ask them questions, and we work with editorial about what those questions would be. So we would test things. So you know, I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about whether I want more of these shares, for example. Do we still need to run shares figures? Surely everyone looks on the internet. Do we still need to have shares figures appearing in the paper? Might be an example of a question that will come to me from editorial, and we could actually go and ask people what they wanted. Okay, the limitation of this is, of course, is they are your most involved readers. They're most engaged with you, so it is not the general view. But it's a guide, and it was a starting point, and sometimes off that would flow the need to do some more investigative research with a broader group of readers.
And how does this differ from a third innovation of yours, the online focus groups?
So online focus groups, and we actually did this specifically for the Australian, because with technology comes some good things. It's, as I said, sometimes it's quite hard to get Australian readers in a room to do focus groups. So we had and also it's quite hard and very expensive to do it across the whole country. We often would have to be going, oh well, Eastern Seaboard, or do we throw in Perth, or which Eastern Seaboard state do we leave out? We know everything about Sydney. Do we really need to do Sydney? But we don't know as much about Melbourne, and Queensland's such a big market for us. You know, having to toss those things up. So having an online process for being able to do that and actually put things in front of people was great. We were experimenting with that. We experimented a bit with that. Kind of moved back away from it, but we use it from time to time when it's appropriate. But we did have a panel going for about 2 years where we would, and you know, one of the interesting things about the people, the Australian readers on that panel was that whatever the discussion was, it would always come back to politics. Doesn't matter what we fed in as something, politics would crop up all on its own, and it would always be, the chatter would always be about something about politics. It was always great. But there was a lot of information. It was quite hard to get all of that information to editorial, to be honest. But great.
And you also are involved in the launching of new magazines like The Wish and The Deal, which aren't particularly political.
No.
And this, so I presume more editorial interest in that. Where does the research come into the launch of those magazines?
Well, this is really interesting because we actually did quite a lot of work on, for example, one of the first things that we had discussions about when we were having discussions about the Weekend Australian magazine, what is now called the Weekend Australian magazine. But when I started, it was actually called the Australian magazine. And we had many discussions and about, you know, what we could do. Was there anything that we could do that could improve the readership? And I went, well, if we call it the Weekend Australian magazine, maybe our readership will improve. So we went through a redesign and fixing things up as a process of that. And it did actually lift our readership. It was amazing because it actually said in the weekend paper that was called the Weekend Australian, and the name of and so on the basis of that, there was some redesign work. We did redesign work on that was successful. Readership grew again, circulation grew again on the back of that. So there was a bit of